Okay, guys, welcome to Conspiro Normal, and we are doing a usually a earlier than normal show today. Well, normal for us. Anybody that's listening to a podcast version, you're listening to it at any time, of course. That's the magic of time travel. But we are once again calling the UK. It is about 11 o'clock or so our time, and 5 o'clock for our guest that we have on. And I would like to welcome on a guest that I heard on another podcast, and about a topic that I have been a little skeptical on, and that has been kind of the whole connections with the current music industry, with the Illuminati symbolism, and all these kind of things. And I've always kind of looked at that as just kind of a continuation of the kind of the satanic panic and the stuff that was going on in the 80s with heavy metal. And so I've always kind of, for lack of a better term, poo-pooed that idea. But then I heard the guest that we have on today on another podcast, and a lot of the things that he said made a lot of sense compared to some of the other topics that we've talked about on this show. And that is Mark Devlin. Mark, welcome to Conspiro Normal.
Good to be on, man. Thanks for inviting me.
Hey, thank you for coming on. I kind of want to get a little bit of feel for you and who you are, kind of your background and some of the time that you have spent, because you've spent a lot of time, most of your career, as a part of the music industry.
Right. Well, I've been a DJ for the last 26 years, a radio and club DJ. So I started out on my first radio station in 1990, close to where I live in Oxford, and I was doing sort of background stuff, making the tea, helping out in the studio, dog's body tasks, you know. And I learnt the craft through that. And then over the next several years, I worked my way up to starting to present shows. And then I got club gigs off the back of that. And so I've been doing that for quite a number of years, and it was my main livelihood. That was my main job for about 20 years. And for most of that time, I was just a part of the industry machine, you might say. So I was doing everything that was expected of you as a DJ, just playing my part, promoting records and, you know, feeding back information to record companies and promo companies, interviewing artists, all that sort of thing. And it wasn't really until 2010 that I came to some stunning realizations about the true nature of what's really going on in this world and the nature of this reality. And the part that the corporate music industry plays in the overall agenda of human enslavement and mass mind control, which is the dynamic we have at work in the world today and has been for a very long time. And I'm sure that won't be too shocking a revelation to most of your audience. I'm sure they've figured this fact out. But my special area of interest from that point on was discovering how the industry that I'd been a part of was involved in this overall process. And it was very important to me to work out how I myself had been mind controlled and taken in and duped by this agenda. And so I set myself on the path of some quite deep research in uncovering all the different kind of nuts and bolts aspects, all the minutiae of how this actually plays out in the music industry. And the result of that was the book that I put out at the start of this year, Musical Truth. And it brings together everything that I'd come to understand in 5 years' worth of research. It took 13 months to write. And from the point that I published the book, everything that I understood, everything that I'd come to know about how the music industry plays its part is between the covers of that book. I have to say that since the book was published, I've discovered a whole lot more. And I've come to realise that it goes even deeper than I'd thought when I put the book out. So that there is a lot of stuff that I could talk about that is not in the book that I've discovered since, but most of what I know is in the book, and I really felt the need to put it out there to communicate to people truth as I understood it, and to get the information out there as widely as possible, because I think it's vital that people understand how they're all being duped and they're all being taken for mugs, just the same way that I was. And they need to understand that the entertainment industry is there for some very nefarious purposes, and it's very far from the fun leisurely entertainment that we think of it as. You know, there's a lot of stuff going on beneath the surface, and I think anyone that wants to know truth and wants to know what's really going on in this world is going to want to pay attention to some of the finer detail.
Okay, well, I want to ask you to kind of add to what you just said. What was kind of like one of the main events that caused you to go down this path of investigating this material? What changed for you at a certain point?
The first thing that I came across in terms of what plays out in the music industry was a whole bunch of occult symbolism that I saw cropping up in music videos and in promotional pictures and record sleeves and live stage shows and that sort of thing. And I noticed the same symbols were cropping up time and time again with all the A-list artists, all the household names that everyone's heard of. And I came to realise, first of all, that this was happening in the contemporary scene. But then I realised that these same signs and symbols could be traced back to previous years and previous decades, and some of the big artists going right back to the 1970s, 1960s, even back to the 1950s. So to start with, it was the likes of Lady Gaga and Katy Perry and Miley Cyrus and Britney Spears, Jay-Z, Beyonce, Rihanna, Kanye West, those sort of artists. And a huge amount of what I discovered came from the website Vigilant Citizen. I don't know if you're familiar with it, but vigilantcitizen.com. Yeah, the guy that runs that site goes into all these symbols and breaks down what they mean and gives you loads of examples of them in popular culture. So it was things like pyramids, all-seeing eyes, snakes, all this sort of stuff, hand signals such as the 666 sign, which masquerades as OK, the OK sign, because all these signs have an innocent-sounding cover story to explain why everyone's flashing them up everywhere. And then you have the horned hand, the so-called Baphomet hand sign that you see everywhere. And the cover story for that is that it means I love you. So that's nice and innocent sounding. But you come to realise that there's got to be a reason why all these artists feel the need to flash up these signs spontaneously at live stage shows and things like that. And you see other figures in popular culture flashing them up as well. Other celebrities, sports stars, Hollywood actors, supermodels, and politicians doing these same symbols. And that's what really first put me on the path to research, because I wanted to understand what the hell was going on here. And then one thing leads to another, and you find yourself diving down many different rabbit holes. And when I do my research online, I usually find myself with at least 12 windows open on my computer at any given time. So I'm darting between these 12 windows and cross-referencing stuff. And before you know it, you're just getting tied up in knots with all this research. And so from the symbolism and the hand signals and stuff like that, I started to look into some of the connections between these prominent artists and some very unsettling, unsavoury aspects such as paedophilia and Satanism and satanic ritual abuse and dark occult rituals. All these aspects are present in the corporate music industry and have been since the start. And people might like to ask themselves why that is. If music is all about entertainment, having a bit of fun, forgetting all the stresses and strains of the working week and just enjoying yourself with a bit of music, whether you're popping on a CD or whether you're going to see a live band or whatever, why do we find things like Satanism, paedophilia, links to organised crime absolutely everywhere? Because you do. And that's before you get into all the family links between so many of these prominent musicians and the military intelligence communities. So organisations such as the CIA, MI5 and MI6 here in Britain, the Tavistock Institute of Human Relations, the Pentagon, the Defence Department, so many links back into these organisations. So very quickly you come to realise that this subject is extremely deep and it goes way beyond what you see on the glossy surface of a Miley Cyrus or Britney Spears video. There's so much more to know. And for any genuine truth seekers that really want to get to the bottom of all this stuff, it goes very deep, and you can tie yourself up in research for days and months if you really want to get to the bottom of all of this. So, you either want the truth or you don't, and if you do, you've got to be prepared to go wherever it takes you.
Let's talk about, because you started in the book, you start off talking about the BBC, and one BBC DJ in particular, and that was Jimmy Savile.
Right.
This was something that in the States has not been focused on. I only heard about it from listening to some other podcasts around the time that it started. and then doing a little bit of research on it. But in the UK, this thing was huge because Savile was such a, well, he was an institution, basically. He was such a mainstay of the BBC radio and BBC television. He had had so much influence as far as with like the Beatles and the Rolling Stones. And this guy was considered, and after he died, it was revealed that he was a huge pedophile, that he had raped young girls. I think they were all in their teens,
and
early
boys.
teens, I believe, and boys too. Interesting. Yep. And that there was even some speculation that he was one of these guys that was a go-between, that he secured children for some really serious politicians, even all the way up to the top.
Sure. Yeah, Jimmy Savile was described as a national treasure, which says a lot for our nation and the institution and the establishment, really. So he was this disc jockey who worked for the BBC for decades. I think he joined in the 1960s, and he stayed with them pretty much up until his death in 2011. He was born on Halloween, incidentally, which tells you a lot, and he died 2 days before his 85th birthday, I believe. But anyway, this guy was the frontman for Top of the Pops, which was this national institution, hugely popular television show running from the 1960s for several decades. He also worked on BBC Radio 1, national station, and he had other popular TV shows such as Jim'll Fix It. And there seems to be a lot more truth to that particular title now that we understand various things about him. So yeah. Jim'll Fix It was this show where he had a bunch of kids coming on, and usually they'd sit, very close to him or sit on his lap. So he must have loved the fact that he was able to get away with that right in front of everyone's eyes. And these kids would ask Jim to fix it for them to meet someone famous or do something, crazy, or do something outrageous like parachute from a plane or something like that. And Jim would use his connections to make it happen. And it seems to be a very thinly veiled mocking of the general public in terms of what was really going on, because we've now come to understand that Jimmy Savile was, as you say, a prolific paedophile, child rapist, and he was very heavily connected into the establishment, and he is said to have been, or has been found to have been, a procurer of children for the rich and famous, for these paedophile rings that run within the BBC. There is massive complicity within the British Broadcasting Corporation in terms of a paedophile ring that's been operating for decades, and it ties into the world of politics. It goes right into Parliament and the House of Commons and the House of Lords here in London, and it even goes all the way up to royalty, the royal family. So Jimmy Savile was a close personal friend of the royals, and in particular Prince Charles. Lots of pictures of Jimmy Savile hanging out with Prince Charles. For Savile's 80th birthday, Prince Charles sent him a pair of gold cufflinks, and they had a message engraved on them, which was, "Dear Jimmy, no one will ever know what you have done for this country." I think there could be a double meaning there. Jimmy Savile was also a close personal friend of Margaret Thatcher, the UK Prime Minister, for many years, and it's said that for several Christmases in a row, he would go and spend the time with her at her house. Can you imagine anything worse, any bigger nightmare than spending Christmas with Jimmy Savile? But anyway, he did.
Hide your children.
Yeah, and so we only came to discover all the sordid truths about Savile about a year after he died. So when he did die in 2011, there were loads of glowing tributes all over the BBC. What a great man he was, a national treasure, such a sad loss, because he used to masquerade behind this public front of doing work for charity. And this is something you find a lot with these paedophiles once they eventually get exposed. Many of them hide behind philanthropy and charitable works, and they present a public face of themselves as these deeply caring individuals and these really nice people to completely throw you off the scent so that nobody would ever suspect them of being into what they really are. Jimmy Savile used to volunteer for work at various hospitals. One of them was Leeds General Infirmary, where he volunteered as a night porter. And it later emerged that as well as paedophilia, Jimmy Savile was also into necrophilia, sex with dead bodies. You know, how sick can you get? And he volunteered to work in Leeds General Infirmary so that he had access to the mortuary and, unfettered access to the dead bodies in there. It's just unbelievable. He also volunteered to work at Stoke Mandeville Hospital in Aylesbury, where he was involved in the spinal injuries unit. And this involved children that were paralysed and that therefore were bedridden. And, revelations have now come forward that he had his way with many of these kids when they were, paralysed and incapable of doing anything about it. So it really is incredibly sick. And it wasn't until a year or so after he died that all this stuff came out. And it does make me wonder whether it was supposed to come out, whether it was, by random accident that these revelations made it out. There was this guy called Mark Williams Thomas, an investigative journalist, who initially worked for the BBC. And I think he discovered some of this stuff about Savile, and he tried to alert BBC management about it, but they didn't want to know. So he went over to ITV, which is the rival TV channel to BBC. Of course, it's still absolutely establishment and controlled in every way. But for some reason, ITV allowed this guy to do a documentary exposing Savile and everything that he'd been up to. So this came out in...
I've seen that one, I think, yeah.
Right. This one came out in October 2012, and this was the one that absolutely shocked the nation, because you had this guy that everyone had thought of as this lovely, wonderful national institution, this DJ that we all know and love, and you come to discover this terrible truth about what he was into. So it makes me wonder whether there was some kind of oath of allegiance, some kind of arrangement which Savile had with the establishment, whereby he would be protected for life from scrutiny. But this oath or this contract expired upon his death. And so that's how
died.
Right, that's how it was that we were able to discover this after he'd gone. But it's pretty clear that he was just the tip of the iceberg, and a lot of people seem to be viewing him as an isolated case. They just say, "Oh, wasn't it terrible what Jimmy Savile was up to?" And in the wake of the Savile revelations, the BBC started chucking a whole load of other washed-up has-been celebrities at the public to imply that they too were involved in some sort of sordid activity of this type. So you had a bunch of people like Stuart Hall, a BBC presenter, and Dave Lee Travis, and Jim Davidson, the comedian, and Rolf Harris, who was another BBC entertainer, and Max Clifford, who was a PR guy. And they were all kind of thrown to the dogs. And the public was sort of given the impression that, yeah, they were up to some sordid stuff as well. But look, we're dealing with it. We're doing something about it. But the truth is that Savile's connections, as I said, go very deep in the establishment. You've got the world of politics. You've got some very senior figures. You've got some aristocrats. You've got senior kind of oligarchs. And you've got the royals. And there seems to have been a desperation to lead the trail away from exposing what some of these figures were involved in, and just giving the impression that it's a couple of washed up, worn out old entertainers that were up to some sleazy stuff in the 1970s as well. So, you know, it really is the tip of the iceberg, and there's so much more to know.
Well, Mark, I'm a big fan of punk rock, and one of the things that really blows my mind is that Johnny Rotten, John Lydon, in 1978, in an interview, and this was not broadcast at the time, but was later, I think, included in some kind of special feature on a DVD or something, or a CD, that he had stated that there was something wrong with Jimmy Savile, that the guy was a pervert. This was in 1978 that this happened. And when I read that in the book, and I had known about it before, but I started thinking about, I'm sure you're familiar with the Sex Pistols, the infamous interview that they had with Bill Grundy on TV,
for sure,
right? You know, the filthy lucre and all that kind of stuff. And you know, Bill Grundy when I look back on it now, he's actually hitting on the girls in the studio, and Steve Jones, calls him out on it. Yeah. And it makes me think, did people just know at the time that all these guys were these pedophiles and these perverts, and it just was common knowledge, but nobody really wanted to talk about it?
Well, it could well be. In the Johnny Rotten interview that you're referring to, he's saying there's all kinds of people I'd like to kill, he says. He says, I'd like to kill Jimmy Savile. I bet he's into all kinds of sordidness that we're not supposed to talk about on the television.
Right.
And at Jimmy Savile's funeral in 2011, one of the people that turned up was the boxer Frank Bruno. I don't know if you guys know Frank Bruno.
No.
He's a black boxer, and he's a bit of a celebrity. He's done pantomime and, been wheeled out on all these mainstream TV shows and stuff. He was a boxer in the 1980s, I think. So, for some reason, Frank Bruno turns up alongside Mike Reed, who's a BBC Radio 1 DJ, a contemporary of Savile. And they're there at Savile's funeral. And Frank Bruno says some very strange things. He says, Jimmy Savile was a great man, he did all kinds of things that I can't get into right now. And he says he helped me in all kinds of ways that I can't talk about on the television. What does that mean? And he appears in a very kind of dissociative state. He appears kind of out of it, And with all the study that I've done of trauma-based mind control and how that works, he certainly appears to be in some kind of mind-controlled trance, So it's very, very strange. And so many celebrities who were contemporary with Savile that worked at the BBC when he did have since come out and said, oh, yeah, we all kind of knew about him. It was an open secret in the corporation, but nobody was allowed to say anything. So it seems that everyone did know. But, there's an important point here, which is this individual that has been presented to us as a national treasure, that was close personal friends with Prince Charles. He was brought in as an advisor to Prince Charles and Lady Diana, Princess Diana, when their relationship started to fail, when their marriage was starting to break down. Jimmy Savile was brought into Kensington Palace as a sort of personal advisor. How the hell does that work? How is he qualified to do that? How did he get so close to Margaret Thatcher, the British Prime Minister, to go and spend Christmas with her in her home? How did he have access to all these other famous people? Why are the British public not completely up in arms about this? Why has no senior BBC Director General from any of those years, bearing in mind this stuff took place over a period of 40 years plus, none of them have ever, as far as I'm aware, been investigated by the police or gone to court to testify as to what it is they knew and how it is that Savile was able to carry all this stuff out on BBC premises, which are paid for by licence payers in the UK. We have to pay a TV tax. Not that many people bother anymore, but we are supposed to.
Because BBC is funded by the government, so it's funded by the people.
Right. Well, the BBC is a propaganda arm for the British government, basically. It's state-controlled. And so we're required to pay a tax, or we're supposed to anyway. They know what they can do with that. But, people the general public are paying for the upkeep of this organisation. Why are they not demanding that it's shut down? This should have spelt the end of the BBC. And at the very least, there should have been some very serious questions asked. And every BBC Director General from the years where Savile was operational should have been called to testify as to how this was allowed to get to take place on their watch. And yet it's not happened. And yet the BBC continues, and people are just going about their daily lives and just acting like, oh, wasn't it terrible about Jimmy Savile? Yeah, still. Anyway, what's for dinner tonight? Nobody is outraged by this. This should have been the story which, when it broke the surface, really lifted the lid on the whole sordid cesspit that is the British institution and all the horrific stuff that goes on there. And yet it didn't. So, it just leads me to wonder, what is it going to take for people to truly wake up to what's going on and just rise up and say, we're not having this anymore? It seems we have a long way to go still.
There's one other point that I wanted to make, and you point this out in your book and also in a presentation that I saw you give online, was about, is it Pugsy Bear? The bear that is the symbol of this charity, right? And you say that there's some very disturbing aspects of that.
Well, yeah, this is the BBC Children in Need. So, are they taking the piss? They do this every year. They roll out this telethon in November of each year. And it's supposed to be for needy children in situations where they need your help, such as being the victims of paedophilia, perhaps, just a thought. But they implore the public every year to give what you can, dig deep, come on folks, help these poor kids out. And I can't help thinking that there would be far fewer children in need if it wasn't for the BBC and those that it employs. But the sick thing about it is, for a number of years, you had people like Jimmy Savile being wheeled out on this telethon as the public face of it. And he's saying, come on, folks, give to these poor kids. And they wheeled out Gary Glitter one year. And Gary Glitter is a pop star from the 70s who was exposed as a vile paedophile back in the early 2000s, way ahead of the current glut of individuals that are getting outed. And so Gary Glitter was wheeled out one year, and Gary Glitter's taking place in this thing. And you have all these other DJs like Jonathan King and Chris Denning who have also been exposed as paedophiles. How much are people going to chalk this up as just a coincidence? Oh, there's another BBC DJ that turns out to have been a child rapist all these years. Oh, what a coincidence, eh? Why are people not making this connection and realising that this is institutionalised and it goes very, very deep? But yeah, the Children in Need thing has a mascot called Pudsey Bear, and it's a teddy bear, and it has a bandaged eye. So it has effectively one eye missing and one eye showing. And going back to what I was talking about at the start, some of the symbolism that I first came across from the likes of Vigilant Citizen, a lot of it pertains to mind control and satanic ritual abuse. And this goes right into what happens to many of these artists that become pop stars. They're abused sexually and in a ritualistic fashion from a very young age. And there are various little telltale signs that are placed right there in plain sight. And later on, if you like, we can get into the reasons why they put all this stuff in plain sight when you might think they would choose to keep it all concealed. But they give you little indicators of what's going on. And when it comes to mind control and satanic ritual abuse, one of them is mutilated dolls and mutilated teddy bears. So these are symbols of the innocence of youth, the innocence of childhood. The doll that you love, the teddy bear that you love. And they're pictured with an arm missing or a leg missing or an eye missing, such as Pudsey Bear. And then some of the other symbolism, when you get into the all-seeing eye, the one eye, you see so many pop stars over the years that have been covering one eye for some reason. And you see all kinds of celebrities doing this, Hollywood actors and stuff. So with Pudsey Bear, you've got this symbol of childhood trauma with a mutilated eye, you could say, or an eye missing, and one eye showing. So it's two symbols for the price of one. And for many years, the bear appeared inside a pyramid. That's the way it was depicted. And all the while, you've got these paedophiles, being paraded on TV. So talk about placing the truth in plain sight. Talk about giving you the opportunity to know. It feels like for all these years, they were mocking us with this mascot, and yet that continues. So every year you've still got Children in Need, you've still got Pudsey Bear as the mascot, and the general public still give their money to it and still don't seem to be able to make the connection between the true nature of the BBC and what's really going on in the world. So that's why I say we've got a long way to go.
Jeff from the Leisure Hour is here.
Hello,
and
Mark.
He is looks like he's chomping at the bit to ask a question.
I am actually. I certainly don't. You've forgotten more than I've ever known about this, about Jimmy Savile and all that. But the thing that I find really interesting about him, and I would love for you to sort of talk to this, is the guy. A lot of the times, whenever you have a pedophile and someone that's into stuff that's like way outside the norm, it seems like they sort of want to stick in the shadows and not make a big fuss about anything, so to speak. And yet he seems so driven and so ambitious, and he works his way up the ranks and all that. I was wondering if you could sort of speak to that, sort of as his personality is concerned. Is he sort of just that, he also loved this is sort of an abstract way of looking at it, but is it just that he had such a personality that it's like, well, let's see if I can get away with it? It was part of the thrill for him.
Like kind of like a sociopathic
yes. Do you think that was sort of at play there, or what are your thoughts on that?
Well, it's pretty clear that he was a psychopath and also a narcissist, and he did love the limelight. He did love he revelled in this role of a national treasure. He did seem to love it. But I wonder also whether he was placed there, whether it was his role in life to be out there in the limelight, in the public spotlight, becoming a household name. Because you come to realise when you study the backgrounds of so many of these prominent figures that we have in popular culture. So not just DJs and pop stars, not just people from the music industry, but Hollywood actors and, boxers like Frank Bruno that I mentioned, all the big sports stars, and prominent politicians, and then business leaders and so-called philanthropists. A lot of these people are what's referred to as lifetime actors. So they're presented to us as one thing, and they have a public persona as a pop star or an actor or whatever, but their true nature lies somewhere else, and we're often given an opportunity to know what their true nature is. I'll give you one example, which would be Bill Gates. So Bill Gates is thought of as, the front man of Microsoft and this nerdy guy that just happened to invent this software company. But of course, you do the digging on Bill Gates, and you don't have to dig very far to find out that he's very much into the eugenics movement. Planned Parenthood specifically. His father was one of the main executives of Planned Parenthood, which is this absolutely outrageous, disgusting organisation that's all about depopulation. And if you look at some of the quotes of Mary Sanger, who was the founder of Planned Parenthood, and how she talks about the masses, the common people, and the fact that they're basically just animals and, this virus that just needs to be wiped out. It's absolutely
she was
shocking.
definitely a eugenicist for sure.
Yeah, for sure. So Bill Gates comes out of that whole thing. And then you find the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation is involved with vaccination programs in Africa, and they're heavily involved with the United Nations, Agenda 21 and all of that. So you think to yourself, well, hang on a minute, maybe Bill Gates isn't this Microsoft guy first and foremost. Maybe he's a eugenicist, and he's given to us as the front man of Microsoft so that he's got a way of getting into the public eye so everyone knows who he is. So you've got to ask yourself if this is what goes on the whole time. And that could well be the case with Jimmy Savile. But there was a very interesting documentary which came out on BBC TV, of all things, in the early 2000s. I think it was 2000, actually. And it was called When Louis Met Jimmy. I don't know if you guys have heard of that.
No.
Right. Well, there was this television presenter called Louis Theroux, and he was a bit of a nerdy guy himself. And his speciality was he did all these wild, wacky programs looking into certain characters, and he had a very eccentric sort of interview style, and he would often draw out aspects of these people's personalities that other presenters wouldn't, just due to his nature. And so he did this one program all about Jimmy Savile, and there was some very revealing stuff in it. So he goes up to Jimmy Savile's flat in Roundhay Park, Leeds. Jimmy Savile, it's turned out, was a close associate of the Yorkshire Ripper, Peter Sutcliffe. And one of the victims of the Yorkshire Ripper was discovered very close to where Jimmy Savile lived in Leeds. There's pictures of Jimmy Savile meeting Peter Sutcliffe, the Yorkshire Ripper, in his jail. And in one of the pictures, Jimmy Savile is introducing the aforementioned Frank Bruno to Peter Sutcliffe. So isn't that an interesting link? So a lot of researchers are speculating on whether Savile was involved in some way with the Ripper murders, given that he had an association with Peter Sutcliffe. But whether he did or not, Louis Theroux visits this flat of his in Leeds near Roundhay Park, and Savile's kind of showing off. He's, he seems to be someone that does love to talk about himself, as you mentioned, and he does a lot of that in this program. And he shows Louis this wardrobe full of women's clothes, and he says, "Oh, these belong to my mother." And he referred to his mother as the Duchess. So the first thing here is that some researchers think that they may well not have been his mother's clothes, and is it possible that they were kind of trinkets or trophies of women that he might have been involved with, raping or killing himself? I guess we can only speculate on that. But the other interesting thing is the fact that he refers to his mother as the Duchess. So we're getting into the concept of bloodlines here and genealogy, ancestry, which is very important to this story, because you find with a lot of these prominent figures, they come from family bloodlines that go back many, many generations. And throughout all these generations, these people have been placed into the public eye in some way or other, whether it's through the world of politics, through the world of entertainment, or whatever. So a lot of researchers think that Jimmy Savile may have come from some kind of significant occult bloodline, and that he may have been some kind of wizard or sorcerer or dark occultist in his own right. There have certainly been stories where witnesses have come forward and said that they witnessed him taking part in satanic ceremonies in various basements and dungeons and stuff, and he seems to have been some sort of high priest of various satanic rituals. So why would that even be a surprise? So is it possible that his mother was, a duchess, if you like, or from some important bloodline, far more than we've come to realise, and that Jimmy Savile was placed in the public eye and given that role as a DJ specifically so that he could become familiar to the general public? Nobody really liked this guy. I remember his show, Jim'll Fix It, when I was a lad, watching it, and he just gave me the creeps. I would talk about him.
He's a creepy-looking dude. I mean, he
for
really
sure.
was.
I would talk about him with other kids at school, and they'd say, "Oh yeah, don't like Jimmy Savile. He's well creepy." So nobody ever seemed to like him, and yet he was always on TV. So why is that? How does that work? He wasn't even a great DJ, and yet he was everywhere. And that's what they do. They have their chosen ones, and they give them roles. These are lifetime actors. And it's all down to the bloodlines that they come from, and they're served up to us as cultural, figures or politicians or whatever, so that we become familiar with them. It seems to be very important to the overall plan.
Let's talk about the mind control connection, because I mean, this is something that we've talked about on this show a lot. The going into MK Ultra, what that was. What's the connection here to mind control in the music industry? And you actually use some examples, and some of the ones I'd like to hit that I thought stood out for me when reading the book was Britney Spears, Mariah Carey, and Nicki Minaj.
Right.
These are you do a very good job of making the case that these people are broken.
Well, they're the best examples we have, those three, certainly.
Yep.
I would say.
I would say so, too.
Is it a coincidence that those are three of my girlfriend's favorites?
Yeah. Damn, she needs to start paying attention to some new artists, dude.
No, she likes a lot of good music, too.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah, so we're talking trauma-based mind control. And it's very closely connected to this program of mass mind control known as MK Ultra, which came out of the CIA, and it's forerunner the OSS. But actually, trauma-based mind control goes way back into the ancient world. There's evidence of it having been practiced in ancient Egypt and ancient Sumer and Babylon. So it seems to be something that's been carried forward through these generational bloodlines right the way up to present day. And it's absolutely rampant in the entertainment business today. So there's this division of MK Ultra, which is known as Monarch Programming. And there's also a division known as Beta Programming, which is also known as Sex Kitten Programming. And this is where you have women who are mind controlled, programmed in a certain way, and they're put out there as sex slaves, effectively, to the rich and famous, or in some cases to other mind control subjects. So the archetypal Beta Sex Kitten icon would be Marilyn Monroe. And there have been so many women who have been shaped in Marilyn Monroe's image in the years since. It's all about that blonde hair and that kind of dissociated look. Madonna appeared as Marilyn Monroe in a Material Girl video, which is interesting, isn't it? And then you've got Anna Nicole Smith, who was absolutely, without doubt, a mind control subject. And she was given to that old rich billionaire guy, as his kind of trophy wife. But in actual fact, she was playing the role of a sex slave. And, she died in some very strange circumstances as well, as did Paula Yates, who was the one-time partner of Bob Geldof, who's another very interesting and very dark character to get into. So that's one aspect of it. But Monarch Programming is what we see play out so much in the music industry. And when you get all these symbols and these little indicators that I mentioned earlier, these clues like teddy bears and broken mirrors and dolls and stuff like that, these are little visual indicators of the fact that the artists in question have undergone this program of mind control. And the way it's done is many of these artists are got at from a very young age. So again, it's going into the bloodlines. They're born into a particular family, and this role of being a pop star or being a Hollywood actor or whatever it is laid out for them from the day they're born. So they really have no choice in the matter by virtue of the family that they're born into. So these roles are laid out for them, and in preparation for them, so that they can be completely controlled, and so that they can be used to further a particular agenda, and so that their actions can all be directed and manipulated, they're subjected to these horrific levels of trauma from about the age of 5 or 6, according to most reports. And it was discovered a very long time ago that the human mind, when it's exposed to horrific levels of overwhelming trauma, the only way that it can deal with what's happening to it is to dissociate from reality and to create these different personas, these different compartments, which are known as alters. So the mind basically shatters into these different sections, and it attempts to lock away these traumatic memories into the dark recesses of the mind in terms of these different personas. And it was discovered by those doing the programming that these different alters, these different personalities, can be called forward at will by way of certain triggers. So it might be a trigger word or a phrase or a colour or a pattern or a sound. But whatever is associated with that particular memory, that particular personality, it can be brought forward to the forefront of that individual's personality and then tucked away again at will. But the rest of the time, this individual operates with their front alter, which is the version of them that people are familiar with, through which they interact on a daily basis. But, all these different other personalities can be brought forward. So sometimes they're triggered deliberately, and other times they're triggered by accident, against the will of the programmers. Something about something they're exposed to seems to bring it forward. And we've seen many examples of this through a bunch of very familiar popular icons. So you mentioned 3 there. 2 of them are fairly obvious. Britney Spears, when she had her famous breakdown in 2007, and she shaved off all her hair, and she started attacking cars with umbrellas and just going a bit crazy. Classic sign of the mind control programming wearing off, breaking down. And the other example would be Nicki Minaj, who is just mind controlled to the core of her bone marrow, and it's fairly obvious that she is. She's presented as a Barbie doll, one of her alter egos is Barbie, and she appears as this doll figure with pink hair looking completely dissociated from reality. She's had these different alters and different personalities that she slips into in interviews. One of the famous ones was Roman Zelensky, which is a play on the convicted paedophile film director Roman Polanski. So she would slip into this alternative voice and just start speaking differently in the middle of interviews. And then a few years ago at the Grammy Awards, this very memorable year where Madonna performed basically a Masonic, Kabbalistic, occult ritual right in front of people's eyes, that same year, Nicki Minaj is said to have exorcised Roman Zelensky from her. So, we're even getting into the realms of demonic possession here. There seems to be a thin line between dissociative identity mind control and demonic possession when it comes to these artists. And then another example would be Mariah Carey, who is less obvious, but there's a story that I cite in the book from 2001 where Mariah Carey started going a bit crazy and she started rambling incoherently, and then she's said to have attempted suicide. And this story broke the surface and it went public, and her publicists were saying, Mariah needs to go into rehab. And this is what you find a lot of the time. These artists start going a bit crazy and you have an incident like the Britney Spears one, and then they're said to have gone into rehab. And this is code for going back into the lab and having the programming topped up. And what a lot of researchers into this area will tell you is that when these artists are programmed from a very young age with these mind control tactics, when they reach the age of usually late 20s to early 30s, you often see signs of the programming starting to wear off and some of the kind of innate humanity of the individual starting to bleed through from the programming, and they start to regain some of their original memories, and they start to, remember who they really are. And it's at that point that they have to be reprogrammed if they're going to be of any further use to the control system. I mean, another one is Lindsay Lohan, who has been in and out of rehab God knows how many times. And, I think most people are familiar with this. And you mention Lindsay Lohan or Britney Spears to a lot of people, and they'll just say, oh, they just go a bit crazy, don't they? I don't know what it is. It's just the world of celebrity. They seem to get into drugs and alcohol, and they just behave that way, and they just act a bit crazy. And so
they blame it on the fame, or they blame it on the pressure, these kind of things.
Yeah. They just get away with it by giving this impression that, oh, it's the pressure of fame and there's a lot of drugs in Hollywood, so of course these people go a bit crazy. But what if there's more to know here? Justin Bieber, a few years ago, came to London and he started acting really strange, turning up to gigs in a gas mask and getting up on stage and just babbling. Nobody could understand what the hell he was talking about. And then the next thing you know, Justin Bieber's gone into rehab. So there's so many indicators, there's so many signs that all these artists are subject of trauma-based mind control. And it goes very, very deep. It goes way back to the early days of the industry. And it ties in to things like satanic ritual abuse, paedophilia, dark occult satanic rituals, and connections into the military intelligence communities. And again, people can look at all of this and think, how the hell can any of these elements be connected? And, it's too much of a stretch to think that these people that we have paraded to us as celebrities can be involved with all this stuff. Well, the truth is the truth, and it's not always convenient, it's not always pleasant, and it doesn't matter whether any one individual believes it or not. It doesn't matter who scoffs at it and who says, oh, this can't possibly be true. I don't need to look at this. It's ridiculous. It goes on being the truth regardless. And that is exactly the kind of public reaction that is relied upon for this agenda to be continued. They want large numbers of people to say, oh, this sounds too fantastic. This sounds too ridiculous. Can't possibly be true. I'm not even going to look at this. For as long as large numbers of people say that and take that attitude to it, guess what? Expect more of the same. It's not until people actually take the diligence and the responsibility to do the research and look at what's really going on that we stand to bring any of it to an end. So I know it's ugly, I know it's dark, I know it's horrific stuff to look into, but like I say, you either want truth or you don't. And if you do, you have to be prepared to go wherever it takes you. And in this story, it takes you very deep indeed.
What's the purpose of putting out these people as mind controlled? What's the purpose of doing that? Is it just because they're more easily controlled? Is it because they will do whatever that they're told to do and to do these performances or put out these music videos with the symbolism? What's the ultimate purpose, the ultimate goal of that?
It is because when you have a celebrity in a mind-controlled state, they are predictable, they are programmable, they can stick with the agenda, you can shape and mould them in any way you want, and they're not going to object to it because they're not in a position to. They don't have the mental capacity to. They don't want maverick, independent artists to express themselves creatively, who go out there and do their own thing. There have been a number of these artists through the years that have kind of crept through, and you can usually spot them in most cases because they're the ones that just happen to die at a very young age in one suspicious circumstance or another, usually a suicide or an overdose. So that tends to be the way that they deal with these truly independent, spirited artists. But for the rest of them, they do like them mind-controlled because they've got them right where they want them. But it goes back to this concept of lifetime actors as well. And they like to place their chosen ones in the public eye and serve them up to us in all these roles. And it's very important for them to do this. It goes back so far as well, through so many generations, and when you start to look at the genealogy of some of these individuals, it becomes absolutely shocking. So Kim Kardashian, for instance, what is she actually famous for? Can anyone answer the question?
I honestly, I can't.
Exactly. Paris Hilton, what is she famous for? What does she do?
Well, I can tell you, they're both rich. They both have money. That's really it.
No, we were told they're famous, and then they were.
Yeah, but
exactly.
Why have people heard of them? Why do everyone knows their names? But what have they actually done? They're served up to us.
It is imbued. The radio, it's everywhere. It is basically a mind control thing where it's just the whole market is saturated. You can't turn on the radio, the TV, anything. You will hear their music or whatever they're doing.
Right.
If they're married, they're getting divorced, all of this stuff, it's in your face constantly.
Right.
And the internet as well.
So Kim Kardashian, nobody seems to know what she's famous for. She's one of these people who's famous for being famous. But genealogists have discovered that apparently she is related through a number of, generations or cousins removed or whatever to the former British Prime Minister David Cameron, who we've just got rid of. David Cameron, in turn, is a distant cousin of the Queen of England. Then you discover that George W. Bush, and therefore George H.W. Bush and Barack Obama, are also distant cousins, and that I think 42 or something like that of all the US presidents have bloodline links, genealogical links, going into English royalty. So what are the chances
That is 100% true. I think Martin Van Buren was the only one that didn't.
Right. So what are the chances of that happening just by accident, just by random chance? Then you get situations like Brad Pitt and Angelina Jolie, who we've heard just this week of Split, are actually related. Who knew that? They're cousins, I think, several times removed. But what are the chances of them just happening to come together like that and just happening to be Hollywood stars when they just happen to be cousins as well? Sherry Booth, which is the maiden name of Sherry Blair, who was the wife of the psychopathic mass-murdering war criminal Tony Blair. It turns out that one of her ancestors was John Wilkes Booth, who is the guy that is said to have assassinated Abraham Lincoln. And so, 100-odd years down the line, she crops up as the wife to the British Prime Minister. Then you have John Phillips of the Mamas and the Papas, just a random example here. One of the prominent bands that came out of Laurel Canyon in the 1960s, that counterculture era.
And like to have sex with his own daughter, by the way.
Well, exactly. Mackenzie, yeah. He raped his own daughter on the eve of her marriage. Nice man. Anyway, his first wife was Susan Adams, and she was descended from the US President John Adams. So what are the chances of the descendant of an American president just happening to pop up as the wife of a prominent rock music artist several generations later? All these bloodlines are interlinked, and all these people that gain any kind of prominent position so that we've heard of them go back into these ancient bloodlines, and they have these ancestral links. So Kim Kardashian has been put together with Kanye. Does anyone believe that Kim and Kanye just fell hopelessly in love with each other? Their hearts beat for each other, and it's this really romantic thing, and they just had to be together? Or does it smack more of an arranged relationship?
Yeah. We mentioned eugenics earlier. I mean, this is what it is. This is eugenics, basically. It's putting the blue bloods and the elite bloodlines together.
Right. But you have arranged relationships as well, such as Beyonce and Jay-Z. Again, are we to believe that Jay and Beyonce met each other at some party or whatever, discovered they had a lot in common, maybe they like the same pasta or something, and, they just got chatting, and, one thing led to another, they started dating, and then the next thing you know, they're going out with each other? I think it's probably more likely the case that they're handlers, they're controllers, because all these artists have them, placed them together because they thought, wouldn't it be great to have two of our key assets, two of our chosen ones, in a relationship together where we can control them even more, keep an eye on them, and place them in the public eye so that they can do their job of mind controlling the people that worship them and leading them off down a particular path. That is what I think it's all about. It's social engineering. It's the shaping of values, of beliefs, of norms. It's telling the public what to think and what to believe about certain situations, and doing it by way of these celebrities that people just worship and adore the way they're instructed to worship and adore them. And unfortunately, most people are so heavily programmed and in such a mind-controlled trance that they don't even realise it's going on. They just are a manipulator's dream because they absolutely go wherever the agenda wants to take them. There's another reason, though, why they place these individuals right there in plain sight for us. And they do give us the opportunity to know what's going on and to understand the true nature of these people and the agenda that they represent. So we're getting into the realms of free will consciousness, free will choice, and consent. And this is quite a deep sort of metaphysical concept. I don't know if you want to go into it right now, because if you've seen the book, you'll probably see that it forms a major part of the latter part of the book where I go into all this stuff. So, we can either talk about it now or later on as you prefer.
Well, I want to actually get into, I do want to talk about that. We can lead into it. The demonic possession aspect of it. Because this is another thing that is fascinating to me. I've heard of the whole thing about you mentioned Beyonce.
Right.
And her whole alter ego, the Sasha Fierce thing. And then you have this Roman Zelensky as in relation to Nicki Minaj.
Sure.
What's going on there?
Well, so many of these artists have these alter egos that they slip into. And it's been a phenomenon that we've seen in fairly recent years within what can loosely be termed hip-hop and R&B and pop music generally. And I don't think of the stuff that we have today as hip-hop and R&B, because I remember the days of real hip-hop and real R&B. And Nicki Minaj and Rihanna and Beyonce and Kanye West and Drake are not real hip-hop and R&B. Whatever else they are, that is something that they're not. But unfortunately, young people today have been conditioned to accept these artists as the real deal and as the trailblazers for those particular genres. And haven't they done a number on those particular styles of music? That's a whole different subject, and actually I'll cover that in a chapter in the book called The Systematic Degeneration of Hip-Hop Culture, because they really have debased and degraded that whole scene. But anyway, within what purports to be hip-hop and R&B, in, I would say, the last probably 10 to 12 years, we've seen a big trend towards artists adopting these alter egos and these alternative personalities. So Eminem has had Slim Shady, and that's been a big part of his work, ever since his first album. He's talked on track about battling these kind of inner demons, and having just talking about being possessed. And Slim Shady just seems to be this alternate personality of his which comes forth at certain points. And as Eminem's career has progressed, his music has got darker and darker, to the point that he's actually talking about being possessed by demons and battling this dark side of himself. And that seems to have had a parallel in Eminem's public life. He was off the scene for quite some time when he was said to have developed an addiction to sleeping pills, and he was an alcoholic, and he came back very briefly and then sort of disappeared from the scene again, and he lost a lot of weight, got very gaunt and thin, and looked quite ill. So a lot of people that have studied this have questioned whether fiction has become reality here, and where on record he's spoken about demonic possession and battling all these demonic entities and stuff, whether that's actually something that's playing out in his real life. Going way back in hip-hop, you had an artist called Cameron, who in about 1998, I think it was, put out an album called Confessions of Fire. And if people listen to the tracks on that, some of them are very dark. And again, he's talking about battling these demonic spirits that seem to be taking him over. DMX, the artist, had a track on one of his albums from right about the same time called Damien. And on track, you just hear this character, who is quite clearly this sort of demonic entity known as Damien, that is getting inside DMX's head and talking to him and coercing him into certain activities like going out and murdering people. And towards the end of the track, he's talking about he feels he's in trouble because this Damien has taken him over. He's taken over his personality. And he put out another track featuring Damien a few years later where, this thing has got even further into him and is directing all his actions. Then you got Beyonce as Sasha Fierce, and that's her alter ego, and she's spoken in interviews about how she feels like this Sasha Fierce character takes her over, and when she goes on stage, she does all kinds of things under Sasha Fierce that she could never do as herself. She can only do it when she becomes Sasha Fierce. And then Jay-Z has been known as Jehovah, he's got that alter ego. Kanye West has been known as Jesus. you got so many other artists that slip in and out of these different sort of personalities and these different alter egos. There's a great book that went into this by a guy called Isaac Weishaupt, which is obviously wordplay. He's a good friend of mine. It's not his real name, of course, but he put out this book called Sacrifice: Magic Behind the Mic, and he really goes into this idea of demonic possession of hip-hop artists and the indicators that are there to suggest that so many of the current glut of hip-hop MCs are probably under some form of occult, ritualistic possession. And he presents a lot of compelling evidence to suggest this. That's probably the best book out there, I would say, in this particular genre that goes into it. But you've got to ask yourself why all these artists have all these alter egos and what the hell is going on here. And when you get something like Nicki Minaj with Roman Zelensky, and then she actually talks of exorcising him in a public show, and she's surrounded by a guy dressed as the Pope and all these people in blood-red satanic robes, you know. What the hell is going on? At what point does this stop being entertainment and start becoming dark occult rituals carried out right in front of our eyes with audiences of several million people when it comes to shows like the Super Bowl halftime and the Grammys, where a lot of this stuff plays out? So Madonna's show of several years ago, where she's depicted as some kind of grand priestess, and there's all this Kabbalistic, Masonic, occult imagery being portrayed. Millions of people around the world.
Baphomet imagery as well, yeah.
Right. Millions of people around the world would have seen all that stuff and absorbed it with no understanding of what's really going on, but it goes straight into the subconscious mind of the general public. And that's where the magic, with a K, works, in the subconscious, because you're off your guard in terms of stuff that your subliminal mind absorbs. The conscious mind is not aware of all this stuff, but symbolism resides in the subconscious mind. That's why they utilize so much of this stuff, because they're literally mind controlling large numbers of people through their subconscious, and what you absorb into your subconscious can actually dictate your thoughts, your belief systems, and your actions, the way you behave, the way you live your life. Psychologists and hypnotherapists will tell you this. You know, it's a big part of their genre. They will tell you that it's all to do with the subconscious mind, and the subconscious mind has been in the crosshairs of this malevolent control system for a very long time, and all these artists are used to target it.
So let's talk about all these images that are being put out in music videos. You mentioned the public performances, such as the halftime show or the Grammys, all these different imagery, occult symbolism, the concept of ritual, and what is the purpose of putting that out there? And how can they, and you mentioned the justification of it, and so I do want to get to that.
Right, well, it's my belief that they give us the opportunity to know their true nature, what they're all about, what these artists are being used for at all points. But they do it in cryptic, encoded ways, very heavy on symbolism, often using numerology, to the point that very few members of the public could reasonably be expected to know what's going on. But nevertheless, the opportunity is there to know if people show the vigilance to understand what these symbols mean and really go away and do the research. And that's what people like me and many other researchers have done, and we present our findings to other people so that they can understand what's being done. You know, people have busy lives. It's understandable that they don't have the time to look into this stuff, and to even bother to look into it, you have to realise that there's a potential problem in the first place, and that there is more to know about a Madonna stage show or a Rihanna video or whatever. So I believe that these dark occultists, this dark occult priest class that control the industry, because that's what it is, ultimately. Yes, there are greedy corporations that like to make loads of money off of artists, and people will often say, oh, there's nothing, you know, particularly nefarious about what's going on. It's just corporations that like making loads of money. That's certainly an aspect to it. But if you're just going to leave it there and think that's the only motivation for what goes on, you're missing the point big time. because the point is that those that run these industries are into the dark occult. They're into the workings of the nature of reality. They absolutely understand magic with a K, ceremonial magic, and they understand how you can shape and mould certain physical outcomes and manifestations according to the will and the intent and the consciousness that you apply to the situation. These are dynamics that are at play in creation, in the universe, and they're open to use by anyone that chooses to tap into them, as long as they have a knowledge of how these dynamics play out. So it doesn't have to be the case that only Satanists and dark occultists can use this kind of ritual magic to bring about their desired outcomes. Any of us can use these dynamics. So those of us that actually want to uplift humanity and, increase consciousness and put a bit of goodness and love and positivity back into the world, we can use all these facilities that are available to us just as much as these dark occultists are doing. It's just the fact that not enough of us realise this and are committed enough to applying it that the occultists are coming out on top, because they are very committed to what they want to bring about, and they're very unified and all operating according to the same plan. They're on the same page together. That's why they get the job done. So I believe that there is an understanding on their part of the dynamic that is in play in creation, which is known as natural law, or the law of cause and effect, of causality, karmic consequence, spiritual law, universal law. It's got many names. You can put whatever label on it you want, but the concept is always the same, which is we have free will consciousness as humans. It's our greatest gift, and we can choose to apply it in whatever way we see fit. And we bring about, or we reap and bring upon ourselves, a certain set of karmic consequences according to how closely we've chosen to align our thoughts and behaviours with the morality of natural law. So the golden rule of it can be summarised as do no harm, or do not treat others in a way you would not wish to be treated yourself. It's the non-aggression principle. It's an expression of the sacred feminine in nature. Its counterpart is the self-defense principle, which can basically be summed up as take no shit. So, you should conduct yourself in a way that does not cause harm to others or take away their rights. And in turn, you have a right to expect that behaviour of others. But if others choose to break that and bring coercion and violence into your life, and they seek to violate your rights and take them away, you then take on the right to do whatever is necessary to defend yourself, defend your rights. So that's the do no shit part, which is an expression of the sacred masculine in nature. So I believe that this concept is understood by these occultists. They realise that they should not be doing harm to us against our will. But if they tell us what they're doing, or if they give us the opportunity to know what's being done to us, and then we don't say, we're not with this, we're not having this, we do not accept this, that to them can be taken as our tacit approval or unspoken consent. So they believe that by not saying no, we've tacitly said yes. So they can then go right ahead and do what it is they'd always planned to do without having to reap the karmic consequence that would ordinarily bear down on them because we've not objected to it. So they're not doing it against our will. They're not violating our rights in any way because we've not said they can't do it. Okay, so
I guess that makes them feel like they can sleep at night, I suppose.
Well, these individuals are psychopaths and they're mentally ill. Let's not lose sight of that. Right. And so you would expect them to have a sick, twisted, distorted view of things. And in my view, they have misunderstood the way this spiritual law works. And they've got a very twisted interpretation of it. But it's the best explanation that I've got as to why they give us these clues and why they give us the opportunity to know what they're all about. And there are many other researchers that agree with me on this, I have to say, that have reached these conclusions, off their own backs. And it does explain why they would do things like place clues in videos, stage shows, promotional pictures. It does explain why they leave their calling cards everywhere. So when you see things like pyramids and all-seeing eyes in videos, and you see the 666 sign and all this stuff, these are all little indicators that let people know who are in the know what they're all about. So if you see an artist flashing up one of these symbols in a pop video, it's a method of communication. So on one level, another occultist can look at that and see, right, okay, so this artist is one of us. This is one of the chosen ones who is down with the agenda, who is controlled. And then to the rest of the general public absorbing all this stuff, again, it goes into their subconscious mind. They have no clue as to what's going on, but it gets lodged there and it works its magic. It has its effect. But because the conscious mind isn't aware of it, you could tell somebody that they're being mind controlled by pop videos and they would deny it till the cows come home. They would say, "Nah, you're joking, mate. No, that can't happen to me. I'm too smart for that. You can't get me." And to these people, I would say, how many times, right, have you found yourself humming a song? It's ringing around your head, and there's a certain point in the day where you think, hang on a minute, I've had this bloody song on my mind all day. And then you think back, and if you rack your brains enough, you can remember you heard it on the breakfast show on the radio when you were driving to work at 7 o'clock that morning. And now it's 4 o'clock in the afternoon, and that song's been in your head all day, and you've only just realised where you heard it. And yet these people will say, "No, you can't get me, you can't get me, I'm too smart for that." And sometimes you find yourself humming a song, and you don't even friggin' like it.
It's happened to me.
You're humming a song, and you think, "I hate this song." And then you think, "Oh my God, I heard it in an ad, didn't I? It was on that ad that I heard last night."
It's a form of mind control in and of itself.
Yeah, so they do get you. And it doesn't matter how smart you think you are and how beyond it you are. They understand how the subconscious mind works, and they're working on it the whole time. So when it comes to free will and consent, I really do believe that they think that by getting our free will consent to a situation, when we don't say, "Hang on a minute, we're not having this, you can't do it," that's their green light to go right ahead and do it and not absorb the karma that would come into play ordinarily. They've shifted the onus and the emphasis on us. And so that's why it's very important for large numbers of people to understand how this metaphysical spiritual dynamic plays out, how it's being used against us, and how we can learn to spot the signs and symbols and the calling cards and get them out of the subconscious mind into the conscious, where they can be understood and the spell can be broken, and we can stop being the mind control subjects of these institutions.
It's a very good point, Mark. Thank you. I want to get to some of the earlier things, because a lot of people think that what we've talked about so far has been more recent music, more the music video era, basically. But you do a good job in the book of looking at the roots of, even going back to the Beatles, the Rolling Stones, the Doors, which is all stuff that I really love and enjoy to this day. And also the Laurel Canyon stuff is interesting, and this connection to intelligence communities,
right?
With the music from the 60s and the 70s.
Right. Well, the work of Dave McGowan into the artists that came out of Laurel Canyon pretty much crops up in every interview that I do. And there's a reason for that, because it's just so key to understanding where so many of these artists come from and these crucial connections back into the world of military intelligence. Dave McGowan did an awesome job of breaking down how that whole hippie counterculture scene that emerged out of the Laurel Canyon neighborhood in Los Angeles in the mid to late 1960s had so many links back into the CIA and the armed forces and the Pentagon and the Defense Department and various other expressions of the US government that it goes way beyond the realms of coincidence. A lot of people have said that in those times, in the post-war decades, in the US, you could have expected a large number of people's fathers to have been involved in the armed forces in some way. And that's true because, in the years coming out of the Second World War, a lot of people did pursue military careers. And, of course, there was the draft as well. And there were things like the Korean War and the Vietnam War, which saw to it that large numbers of young men were being called up into the armed forces. But what McGowan points out in his book, Weird Scenes Inside the Canyon, is that so many of the fathers of these prominent artists weren't just rank-and-file foot soldiers that were sent out there on the front line to do all the fighting. You know, these were senior figures, admirals, generals, people very high up in these organisations and with very key positions in organisations like the CIA and such. So what are the chances of all these musicians that came out of that scene all having fathers and other family connections, often mothers, sisters, brothers, going back into these institutions? You know, again, it goes way beyond the realms of coincidence in my book. So McGowan did a great job of giving all these examples, and the famous one that you always hear, of course, is that Jim Morrison of the Doors, his father, Admiral George Stephen Morrison, was the US naval commander that was controlling the fleet of ships involved in the Gulf of Tonkin false flag incident, which catapulted America into the Vietnam War. And he gives so many other examples. You know, Frank Zappa. Who would have believed that Frank Zappa's father was involved in chemical weapons bio research for the US government, working out of the Edgewood Arsenal military base in Maryland, where Frank Zappa was born and grew up. And so many other examples. John Phillips of the Mamas and the Papas came from a career military intelligence family. Pretty much all the key artists coming out of the Byrds and Buffalo Springfield and Crosby, Stills, Nash and Young, you know, all came out of the CIA and the armed forces and all of that, and all these other groups that came out of that scene. And he asked the question, why is it that so many of these artists congregated around Laurel Canyon anyway, when most people think of the epicenter of the hippie counterculture scene of the 1960s as being San Francisco, the Haight-Ashbury district? In actual fact,